The story of how I got interested in healing, both professionally and personally, began when I was 10. And I often tell this story because I developed really a terrible psychotic episode and then obsessive compulsive disorder. And without going into the details, suffice it to say that I could see scary things that were not quite manifest, things like headhunters with blowguns. I thought they were going to kill my parents and my brother, and I could see them half-formed, as if manifesting from another realm. And the OCD and the psychotic aspect of it was I actually believed that I was the only one who could prevent them from manifesting. And so with OCD, you do all kinds of rituals. Hand washing is a very typical one. For me, all my reading had to be upside down and backwards, and I couldn't speak until I had everything centered in a mental list. And it was a dark night of the soul, doesn't even begin to describe it. I lived in a landscape of such terror. I have to be careful. I don't even want to remember it. And it was that way for about 6 months. My parents took me to wonderful psychiatrists, none of whom had anything to offer, because that was when I was 10 years old, which is 60 years ago. There was no Klonopin, no Prozac, no behavior therapy, nothing to offer. And one day I thought to myself, what would happen if I sat and prayed? And I didn't come from the kind of family that prayed, had a kind of agnostic dad who was a nature mystic, and a mother they were both Jewish, but my mother was an atheist. That happens when you lose big chunks of your family in the Holocaust. Sometimes you ask the question, if God is loving, if prayer works, if healing is possible, why do terrible things happen to people? But there's the old saying, there are no atheists in foxholes, so I figured I might as well pray and see if anything happened. And it did. The tremendous terror was replaced by a peace that I cannot even describe to you. There's a biblical phrase, the peace that passeth understanding. And it was such a sense of deep loving, being known, being supported from some other realm. And everything was clear. And I knew things that I didn't know in my ordinary mind. And I knew exactly how to heal. Number one, I knew that healing was possible. And number two, I knew precisely how to go about it, which I will not tell at this moment. Too long a story. And within 3 days, all of the nightmares, all of the hallucinations of headhunters, all the need to do rituals had simply gone. That was it. And I was restored not so much to my normal state, but to a state where I knew there were multiple realms of existence, that this was just one of them. And I became fascinated with what the nature of healing is. And I became fascinated with brain science. I was in the 5th grade. We were studying the brain. And you get questions like, how is it that you're tuned into one frequency with your brain and then something happens? And you see other frequencies. Healing can happen. Headhunters can happen. The whole range of human possibilities unfurled. And as I grew older, I grew more interested in the brain science, more interested in the psychology, and more interested in states of consciousness, and particularly the state of peace. I think we're all so driven by fear, and in part because it's a survival need. But I thought there are ways to get to a place of peace, and I'd like to learn more about them and be able to go back to that state of peace and be able to help others go back to it. So that was basically what set me on the path. The rest of my CV, I'll be really brief. In college, double majored in biology and psychology and was always writing papers on the nature of consciousness. And then I decided my best bet was to get a PhD from Harvard Medical School because there were people working there both in the field of consciousness and in neuroscience that I wanted to study with. And I ended up actually getting my doctorate from Harvard Medical School in the field of cellular biology. And then I became a cancer cell biologist. I worked for many years. I had a lab at Tufts Medical School, and I studied cancer cells, what makes them cancerous, how they might become normal again. And then my beloved father had cancer, and he died not from cancer, but from suicide, because the drug that they gave him to keep his lymphocytes from dividing too quickly, it was a form of leukemia he had, created a manic psychosis, a state that I knew only too well, at least the psychotic part, from being 10. And they took him off the drug at one point to do a surgery, and he waited until my mother had fallen asleep one night, opened up the window of their 36th-story condo, and jumped to his death. And I have to say that anything I say here, or every talk that I give to people with cancer or to hospitals or about healing, I always dedicate it in my heart to my father, because I probably would be sitting in a laboratory to this day if that terrible thing hadn't happened. And as I thought how I could make meaning of that event, I thought, if only I could help even one other family have a better outcome than we had as a family, it would mean a lot to me. And so I decided to go into a new field called behavioral medicine. And there I studied healing, started a mind-body clinic for people with cancer, then another one for people with AIDS, then a third for people with chronic illness or stress-related illness, and wrote 17 books.
What is that explanation of where cancer cells come from?
With cancer cells, first of all, years ago, a study was done where our carcinogen, which is a chemical that creates cancer, was painted on the side of a salamander. And instead of growing a cancer, the salamander grew a new limb. And I do believe that for me, the reason that cancer starts is that something has challenged the organism to evolve. And cancer is a misguided form of evolution. And it's a signal that there's something in your life that's incredibly irritating to your body or to your mind or emotions. And cancer comes from that. And when I was still a cancer cell biologist, I was doing work on a field that had not yet been named, the field of epigenetics. And I thought, if I take these cancer cells and I put them in a tissue culture medium that has different things in it from the normal tissue culture medium, could I heal the cells? And I found by changing the kinds of fatty acids in the tissue culture medium, and fatty acids are what make the cell membrane, and the cell membrane is how cells communicate with each other, I could get tumor cells to look and act normal. Now, their genes didn't change. They still had cancer genes. However, the best way I can say it, it's like if you've got a chair and all the stuffing is falling out and it's starting to pull apart, and you put a really tight upholstery, it still functions. And that's what I could do with the cancer cells. And I think at times we can do that with cells, not in tissue culture, but our own cells. So, for example, our hormones that respond to our emotions get into the tissue culture that we are. I mean, we're a big bag of cells, and we're surrounded by different fluids. And our emotions all release different neurohormones, really. And those can change, they're an epigenetic factor, they can change cancer cells. Our diet, that's what I was working with. I was working with changing fats in the tissue culture cell. When we change the way that we eat, there's certainly some evidence that for at least some subset of people, cancer can occasionally go into remission from dietary change. And I became very, very fascinated with all the levels of cancer, and particularly to see when somebody suddenly recovers and hasn't even done anything like change their diet, what happened, and can we study that? And there are cases of what are called, quote, spontaneous remission. The medical term means they weren't given medical treatment, and unfortunately they don't realize sometimes, the researchers didn't used to realize, there are other things than chemotherapy that might create a change. But there are three things that have been found to be commonalities with people who have spontaneous remission. One of them is that they believe it is possible to heal. Secondly, they believe it not just generally, but specifically. They believe, I can heal. And third, they have a transformative spiritual experience. And a person can have all three of those things and heal in many ways, but maybe their body doesn't heal. Or they may have a remission, because I think we need to understand that the body is a temporary abode in any case. It lasts as long as it lasts. And healing, physical healing, is very different from spiritual healing, which is really penetrating that sense that we're separate from each other, that life is not meaningful, and recognizing that everything is interconnected, and that it's like that experience I had when I was 10. I had a direct experience that it sounds so silly from a scientist, and there's no good way to put it, but everything is made of love. Everything is crafted of a luminosity of love from which everything manifests. And that's an emergent kind of science. I think only quantum mechanics begins to look at that. But regular biology has not gotten that far yet. But healing is really jumping out of the matrix into a different reality of love. And I think that's what we're here for, to learn how to love and to inspire other people and to spread compassion in this troubled world. And that's what healing for me really is.
If a disease comes up for us, whether it be cancer, whether it be lupus or something chronic, is that a sign that we need to do some forgiveness, love ourselves? Talk about connection and what that means.
When you think about love in a very deep sense, it's a sense of mindful connection and spaciousness and regard and respect for all that lives. And when I think of it at a very local perspective, it means things like what kinds of poisons are in the environment. Can that be cleaned up for a person with any disease? Are there poisons in your home that need to be cleaned up? Are there poisons in your food? Do you need to really change to eating organic food? And if you eat meat, to eat meat from animals who had a good life, who were respected, who themselves ate well. I love Michael Pollan, the food writer's statement, we are what we eat eats. And that's so absolutely true. Mm-hmm. And our water needs to be pure. We need to clean this up for ourselves and in our communities and in our world. That's one aspect. Then we need to clean up our own toxic emotions. So my Buddhist friends talk about the 5 kleshas. That always makes me laugh. It sounds like a Yiddish word, like, oh, I've got kleshas. But there are things like, one of them is the same in Sanskrit and Hindu. One of them is avidya, ignorance of the fact that everything is interconnected, that we're all independent, that nothing arises by itself, that's one aspect of things. And if you think you're separate and alone in this life, of course it afflicts you. It makes you feel lonely. And what I can tell you from my scientist hat is that loneliness does bad things to the immune system, to the cardiovascular system. The science of love is amazing, what it does for us. And the opposite is the sense of loneliness. But there are, 4 other kind of afflictive emotions. And what you need to look at is your own emotional life. And all emotions are good emotions in the end, because they all tell you something. And it's so good to let an emotion be there, to see what it is, to be curious, to be mindful, to be present to it, and then to be able to see, has it led me somewhere, like I'm holding on to a regret or a resentment? And then you have to get down to business and let go of the regrets and the resentments, and then you will not be prone to hold on to that emotion. When I was running a mind-body clinic, for example, what I found is we kept needing to come back to regrets and resentment. When I would interview people after our 10-week program was over and then interview them again a year later, what I would find is that some people, it was a program based on meditation, on mindfulness, on forgiveness, on gratitude, on using the imagination, on cleaning up your life at all of these different levels. And when I called people back, and some people just didn't heal. Nothing much changed. And almost always they were hanging on to a regret or a resentment that kept them stuck. And I'd say that that's a very important part of healing. You can't feel connected to something when there's a block in the line somewhere. And these things are all important. And you can't heal if it's also only for yourself. Whatever it is that you receive, there's a natural flow. It needs to flow out to others. It needs to give back. And I do find in the healing process, so often for people, there comes the need to share what it was that they learned, to give back, to provide healing for other people.
Whether it's a painful emotion or physical pain, I'd really love to give people a tool of how to deal with it or look at it differently so that they're not resisting against it. You talk about pain and then your attitude towards pain. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. It's really important for people to understand things at an embodied level. We've all had an experience. You get it intellectually, but you don't have it really in your body. And that's the important part. So there are 2 parts to that. One of them is the practice of mindfulness. For example, I used to have terrible migraines. Up would come a migraine, and I would start to throw up. I would be partly blind. I would be so sick, amazingly sick, before there were any medications. And then I made the sickness worse because I'd think, what's wrong with me? Everybody else has a life. I never know when I'll be sick. I never know when I'll be well. This is a terrible thing. And I'd start to cry, and it would just make the pain worse. Then, once I learned about mindfulness later in my life, I remember the day I was sitting in my laboratory when I was still a cancer cell biologist. Up came a migraine, and I had the immediate thought, oh God, who's going to pick up the kids from daycare? How many days will it last? And then finally I said, Joan, your resistance is making it worse. Just be present to the pain. And it was such a deep pain behind one eye, but instead of judging it as pain, mindfulness means curiosity. And I just started to be curious. And it wasn't like a monolithic pain. it flickers. It gets over here. It goes over there. It's excruciating. It crosses the boundary to pleasure. It does all these things. And as I kept breathing, and that's key to it, you have to keep breathing. Breathing is all about connection. You keep dropping your breath into your belly, dropping your breath, being curious, observing. I noticed that the pain actually began to let up. And after about 10 or 15 minutes of observing it, the migraine actually went away. Now, I'm not saying people's pain will always go away, but I am saying it's likely that it will change and lighten up a little bit, and you won't have added the layer of suffering to it. Instead, you're curious, you're present. That's one thing. And that's the embodied part. If it isn't embodied, you don't believe it. The other part is about your view of the world. If you consider pain a rite of passage, it's very different. So here's an example. A young woman with cancer came into my clinic, and she had a really, really aggressive form of breast cancer, and she knew that. And yet there was some hope in her. And she said to me, direct quote, she said, "The day I got my diagnosis, I died to who I was." And of course, that's what happens. Your whole life disintegrates in that moment. But then she went on and she said, "But I haven't yet been reborn to who I'm going to become." And that is the key. I knew right away that she was going to do very well, because she had a sense of continuity, even in the way that she spoke. She was telling a story that told me this woman expects to live. And that's very, very important. And what she was really delineating were the classic 3 stages of a rite of passage. And that's what every shaman has, is a rite of passage before they come back, with the ability to heal and the ability to walk behind and between and through the various worlds and see the various quantum levels of things and work with energy on a level where they can really be a healer. And they all go through a kind of death, usually a very serious illness of some sort or another. It's very typical. And a rite of passage, every good Hollywood movie, by the way, is based on a rite of passage. It's what Joseph Campbell talked about as the hero's journey. First, your world disintegrates, like the young woman who got cancer. Second, you go into the time between no longer and not yet. You're not who you were, and you're not who you are becoming. And that's a sacred time, the time between no longer and not yet. It's a scary time because you have no markers. It's a time when you have to really learn to be present to the unknown. And it's a time when you find your mentors. It's a time when people, they search for what's really true. It's a time when they search for healing. And it's a powerful time. And then when people come through that, the 3rd stage of a rite of passage is called the return. And when they return, they have something precious to give to other people. And that's why I said people who go through this, they almost always want to give back. They want to share what they learned with others. And it's very important. And so I started to incorporate that into my work with people. Somebody would come in and say, "Oh God, I have this terrible disease. I'm a victim." That's very disempowering. It takes away hope. You have to know that there's hope and that there's a cycle here. Yep, you died to who you were so that you could reconfigure at a whole new level. It's like the law of dissipative structures. That was Ilya Prigogine won a Nobel Prize for that. He was a physicist. And he said it's true at every level, as above, so below, from the molecules to the furthest reaches of the furthest universe. Things break down so that they can reconfigure at a higher level. And that gives people hope. So I always tell people, well, you're in the midst of a rite of initiation.
spiritual healing is one thing and physical healing is another, but do you believe that the human body is capable of healing from anything?
There is absolutely no end to possibility. The human body is capable of healing from anything. When I had just made the switch from being a cancer cell biologist to running a mind-body clinic, I was researching spontaneous remission. I came across the case of an Australian man by the name of Ian Gawler. And in the medical journal, there was a picture of his lungs. He had an osteosarcoma, a cancer of the bone. He'd had his leg amputated right at the top of the thigh, and the cancer had spread, and you could see like golf ball-sized tumors with bone spicules sticking out from them in the x-ray of his lungs. And he believed that healing was possible. When his family was already grieving that he was about to die, he married his nurse. He was a veterinarian. He went to see the healers in the Philippines, and they changed his diet. They loved him up. Love is a very important part of it. They loved him all up. They gave him all kinds of lotions and potions and energy healing, and he actually recovered. And it took a long time. It wasn't immediate. It took several years for him to recover. And he became, I think of him as the Bernie Siegel of Australia, running a big center for people with cancer. And Ian is still alive and doing his very good work. The chances medically for that happening were a great big zero. He was basically dead man walking. And when you see what's possible, it's very important, because what people really need to know is if they can see one person who made it, they know that it's possible. And that hope gives them the will to live.
So you talk about meditation and mindfulness. You say it's the most important tool for self-healing and self-regulation. So can you talk a little bit about the physiological and psychological benefits of meditation?
Well, yes. Meditation has been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. If you go all the way back to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and this is what, people do yoga, and yoga is more than the body. There are 8 branches of yoga, and Patanjali was one of the early yogis who wrote down kind of the basic threads, like a sutra. That's a sutra, the Yoga Sutras. And the first thing he said about yoga is that yoga is stilling the modifications of the mind, because we all have the mind is yapping all the time, and it's telling us generally scary and limiting things. The mind is wonderful when you're using it as a tool. It's not so great when it's calling the shots. There's a deeper part of you than the mind, and people have different ways of talking about that. Your essential nature, or your inner self, or your spiritual self. And every culture, every religion actually has words for that. And we all know that place, the moment that you really have an experience of awe and wonder, and your mind is quiet, and you literally become one with the light on the mountains, or the look on the face of a newborn child, or whatever it is that's given you awe. You access the same part of you that meditation accesses, and that's beyond that busy, busy brain. When that happens, self-regulation of the body happens. Patanjali talked a great deal about this, how it is that we regulate the breath, how things come into balance. And the very first research on meditation done by a mentor of mine, Dr. Herbert Benson, he was one of the first researchers, he said, well, it shuts down the fight or flight response, the fear response, and it stimulates the parasympathetic or relaxing nervous system of the body. And that's what heals. And people need to understand that the body understands how to heal itself. It's the natural state of the body is to heal itself. But that stress gets in the way. So at the very most basic level, meditation relieves stress. And mindfulness is not only a type of meditation, but it's an attitude toward life of curiosity and openness rather than judgment. And of course, that makes life ever so much more interesting and enjoyable when we're curious, because we see so many more things. So meditation leads to states of mindfulness, whatever type of meditation you do. And now we know so much about how meditation changes the brain, that people who meditate, their brains have much more activity over here in their left prefrontal cortex. And your prefrontal cortex, actually, it's the evolutionarily most recent part of the brain. And it modulates between your emotions and the external world. So this will tell you, like, calm down already. There's no tiger. I'm looking around. There's nothing out there. Or it tells you there's a certain goal that you want to set. And when negative things come up from the midbrain, from the amygdala, from the fear centers, it realizes, having those emotions is just not consistent with what I want to do. And you're able to calm down. So your left prefrontal cortex is the place where resilience arises from. And healing requires resilience. And it's nice to know that meditation actually changes the wiring of the brain so you become more resilient. When you meditate, let's say you're doing yoga, and I'm doing yoga now. I don't have to do Ashtanga yoga and, great acts of physicality. I'm being mindful. I'm working with my breath. And yoga or Qigong release GABA. It's a neurotransmitter, gamma-aminobutyric acid, and that also calms down the amygdala. Then meditation creates epigenetic changes. And those changes, that we're just at the beginning of the exploration of epigenetic changes in meditation. And I'm sure that some of them are going to be related to the ability to heal.
And so just for people that don't know, what is epigenetics?
Epigenetics is a cool field. And what it means is this. Just think about this for a minute. Our genes change very, very slowly over millions of years. And that's a really good thing. That means that a baby born today looks like a human baby, not like an ostrich or a giraffe or a rhinoceros. We're still human. And the other thing, though, is the environment around us is changing all the time. Even at the time when Paleolithic humans began to plant crops, and we didn't have wheat before, and wheat has changed. I'm not going to get into whether wheat is good or bad for you, but the fact is we didn't used to be able to take it in and get nourishment from it, metabolize it, but it was around and it was a food source. So the environment changed. When wheat came into the body, the genes were able to have the ability to actually digest the wheat. Now, how does that change? The environment changed, what we ate changed, and we developed new abilities. The chromosomes didn't change, the genes didn't change, but gene expression changed. So I'll explain this. You have 10 trillion human cells in your body. That's and they're very tiny. You, by the way, have 90 trillion microbes in your body. We're almost 10 to 1 made of microbes rather than human cells. However, in terms of our human cells, each cell has a really tiny nucleus, and in our tiny nucleus, we have 6 feet of DNA. Now, that would be a tangled old mess, except it's wrapped around a spool. Now, this is where epigenetics comes in. Something from the environment that we need to adapt to. It could be temperature. It could be some of the technological things, maybe even toxins that get into us. Whatever it is, these can change the way that the DNA is wrapped around the spool so that strands of DNA, loops of DNA, become either available for transcription, meaning that the point of DNA is that it makes proteins, and it's called transcription, the process from which a gene makes a protein, so that either you make proteins or other environmental signals cause those little loops of DNA to close down tight so they're not available for transcription, so that the actual proteins that your same genes make are totally different depending on signals from the environment. And that is an amazing thing, and it shows why you are not doomed by your DNA. People who have the same DNA, who have the same susceptibility to illness, one can become ill and the other can stay well. One can heal and the other can't, all because they optimize the environmental factors that control gene activity. And that's what the field of epigenetics is all about.
You say we rarely see things for what they are. We're actually seeing the reflection of our past conditioning. Can you explain how our past conditioning creates our reality? If we don't like our reality, for instance, if we're sick, how do we change that lens?
Women they look around and they say, I want to look like her. I want to be tall and skinny. Well, if you're not tall and skinny, you start to tell yourself a story about how you don't like yourself, how your body is not the body it's meant to be. Then, look, I'm short. I'm 5'3", and I have a more Rubenesque type of figure. I spent a great deal of my life wanting to be somebody else and not appreciating how beautiful my own body is, how lovely the curves are, how wonderful it feels. And I caused myself a tremendous amount of stress. And I think many women can do the same thing. And I'm going to tell you a story about that. We have to change our story and find the beauty within us, or the beauty within all things. What's prejudice? It's making up a story about people who are different than you, that somehow they're less than you because you cannot see who they are. And so our conditioning prevents us from seeing reality as it is on all the different little levels of reality. We can't see it. There was a woman, her first name was Edie. She was a nurse, and she developed ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And that is a terrible disease to have. And most of the time it leads to pretty rapid disintegration, being in a wheelchair, losing your ability to speak, your ability to eat, and finally results in death. Well, Edie was in a wheelchair. She tells this story publicly all the time. She was going downhill fast, and it occurred to her that the way she hated her body had put such stress on her, and that maybe she could find something about herself that she liked and make that a practice. I forget exactly what body part Edie found, but I started to do this myself. And I'd look in the mirror, and instead of finding fault with it, I'd say to myself, what beautiful eyes you have, Joan. And I would simply give love to my eyes. And Edie did this kind of thing. She'd look every day in the mirror, and she'd find something about herself that she liked until she finally loved her body. And she did other work as well, but Edie actually recovered from ALS 20 years ago and now is an inspirational speaker.
ALS is one of the things that's like, how do you possibly recover from that? You know, your mind is clear, but your body is, you're a prisoner,
That's
really,
right.
of
You're
your
a prisoner.
own body. So, wow, thank you for sharing that. I read in your book that the Chinese word or symbol for crisis combines danger and opportunity. I love this as a metaphor for disease, too, because the fear and the danger of impending doom, but it's also an opportunity. Can you talk about that?
The founder of American psychology, William James, he wrote the coolest book called Varieties of Religious Experience. And that book came out in 1904. And if you look at the chapter on healthy mindedness, it is precisely the same as what we call integrative medicine today. The part of it that's mind and body, what we're talking about has been known for a very long time. And he said this, he said, people grow. They grow their hearts and they grow their minds in two ways. One of them is kind of gradually by lysis. You know, you get a little older and you realize the concerns you had when you were younger are not that important. Your view changes and you grow. The other one is through crisis. People grow through crisis. And that's really very, very true. If you ask wise people how they grew, what were the most transformative events in their life, most usually they're going to tell you a story of having had a terrible illness, or, God forbid, having lost a child, or having gotten divorced, and all of a sudden realizing, wait a minute here, I need to understand who I am before I couple up with anybody else again. Whatever it is, it's that because it breaks the pattern, it breaks the matrix. Whatever the difficult thing is, the danger and opportunity is, it shatters your life. And therefore, it shatters all the stories you were telling yourself and the way that you hold your reality together. And when it's shattered, there's a chance to expand and have a different point of view, and that's the opportunity. And we do this now in part through a new field called narrative medicine. There's actually a master's degree program at Columbia University in New York for healthcare practitioners in narrative medicine. What is story? What is the arc of story? How do we learn to change our story? Because that's it. So I'll take something like forgiveness. Somebody, God forbid, did something terrible to you. You were raped. Let's take that. That is a terrible thing to happen. It's a terrible danger. And as long as you hold on to rerunning how awful it is, you have to grieve first. Let me say that. It's so important to grieve our losses, and we don't do that well. But at a certain point, when years later, you're still rerunning that story, you're still telling yourself the same thing about that truly low-down, dirty dog, you're still seeing the whole thing as it was, you stay stuck there. And then the person who hurt you once has got power over you for the rest of your life because you keep invoking them by telling the same grievance story. So there's a really cool study that was done, and it was women who had emotionally abusive spouses, but they were finally able to get it together and leave the marriage. And women who'd been out of an abusive situation for at least a year were brought into the study. And they were assigned to one of two groups. One group was assertiveness training and anger management so that they wouldn't let another abusive person into their life. The other one was forgiveness training. And forgiveness in this study was all about changing a story. It was about a different narrative. So instead of rerunning all the things the low-down, dirty dog done did to you, instead you start to say, what are the benefits? What did I learn? What were the strengths in me that really came to the surface when I finally decided to leave? And, you know, it might be before that I thought I really needed to have another person to take care of me. But I realized I'm sufficient, I'm autonomous, I know how to take care of myself, and I planned how to get out of there, and I did get out of there. And when you become the heroine of your own story, you have a new story. You're not rerunning your grievance story. You're rerunning the, hey, I am a really cool person story. And that makes all the difference.
If you just get a daunting diagnosis, how do you move through the fear to the hope?
This is a really important question because at first, most everybody feels really, really, really frightened. And grief and fear need to have a little space first. You have to grieve. You have to scream and yell and wish it was otherwise. At least most people do. Not everybody. We're all different. But then there comes a time when you realize, I'm still alive. And do I want to live in constant fear, or would I like to calm down a little bit? And that's where things come in to help you calm down. One of them is a very simple thing. We need the presence of others. And when we're afraid and when we're grieving, for a lot of people, they isolate and separate. And it's so important to come together. You know, I used to run a mind-body clinic. And what I heard time and time and time again is, thank God that we come together in a group, because I can be with other people and they share with me things that I need to hear. And so that's important. Make sure that you have the shelter of other people around you. The fastest way to make progress in managing your fear is actually breathing. And breathing techniques are really simple. The simplest possible breathing technique that really calms down the central nervous system and also helps you release the neurotransmitter GABA from the brain and directly changes the fear centers of the brain is this. And what you do is you inhale very, very slowly through your nose. Then you purse your lips. And exhale till the breath's all gone. And then inhale again through the nose and then out as if you were breathing through a straw. And generally your breath will slow down to about, up where I feel it after 2 breaths, your breath will slow down to about 4 to 6 breaths per minute. And that completely changes your nervous system. You move out of fight or flight. You move into that parasympathetic relaxation response, and it helps you. And then you can calm yourself down a little bit, and then you can say to yourself, what was I thinking that created so much fear for me? Well, I was thinking about dying, or I was thinking about treatment, or whatever. And yet, for that moment or two, I actually managed to be pretty calm. And the truth is, I don't know whether I'm going to live or die. We'll all die eventually. And you start to talk to yourself in a more hopeful way. And this is opening up possibility by learning to live more in the present. You're not dead now. We're alive now. None of us knows what's going to happen next. And once you're calmed down, you can start to work with your story in that way. And ultimately, what I've seen people do is become incredible warriors of surrender. And surrender is not like, okay, shoot me. Surrender is, I'm going to be mindful and present right now. I'm just going to live in this moment. And if I'm scared, I'm spacious enough to say, yep, I'm scared right now. And it's okay to be scared. And I'm just going to breathe and be scared and be mindful of the fear. And the fear goes too. And it just, you begin to be emotionally more balanced no matter what life brings you. And I mean, for most of us, and of course, myself included, we all like to be happy. And we think, oh, I'm so balanced, I'm all blissed out, I'm so happy. But then something bad happens and you get all bummed out. And it's not that you never get bummed out again, but you get more spacious about being bummed out. You don't hold on to it so long. And then you can manage, and then you're the sort of person, and I know many of them, who they've been dealing with a major illness, and what people see of them is they're such peaceful, calm, beautiful people. And then they say, how do I get that way? Mm-hmm. And that's when people will frequently say, not that I ever would have asked for this illness, but maybe I wouldn't give it up because I've learned so much. And that's inspiring to me. That gives me hope. And the old yogis, the idea that the yogis give us is, after you get to a certain point of having practiced these meditation techniques and all the rest, you get to the point where you're, quote, beyond praise and blame. None of that touches you so much. But little by little, you find happiness comes from within you, not so much from the circumstances of your life being that one has cancer and one has something else, but it's an internal deal. And that's always the opportunity in illness.
I love laughter. It's been said laughter is the best medicine. I know people that have healed through laughter. And you talk about some real physiological benefits of laughter. So keep it light, right?
You keep it light. When you laugh, I think, in the beginning of the field of mind-body medicine, Norman Cousins was still alive. And Norman Cousins had ankylosing spondylitis, this serious arthritis that mostly the doctor said, well, what position would you like to freeze in? It's like rusting in place it can be. And he went off with funny movies. He rented a hotel room, had friends come. For something like 3 weeks, he laughed and listened and watched and heard jokes and saw movies. And at the end of that, his arthritis had been arrested, because there's a whole science of laughter. You release all kinds of good neurohormones from laughter. And also, you don't feel sorry for yourself. It interrupts the narrative of, oh, me, poor me. And I have a great friend, the humorist Loretta LaRoche. She's great. She's done 8 PBS specials. She's taught positive psychology at Harvard. In one of her books, she has epitaphs, what's going to be written on your tombstone. And every time I get busy and start to feel sorry for myself and say, oh, the to-do list is so long, I'll never finish. How did this happen? I think of the epitaph that Loretta mentioned, which is, got it all done, dead anyway. I just have a great laugh. And I said, I guess I'm not going to get it done. I'm just going to go for a walk instead. And it breaks the trance. As healing is a lot about breaking the trance and opening up to something larger on every level of life, deeper relationship, deeper sense of communion with your own self, with others, and of course with whole other levels of reality. And that's the blessing in something that's very fearful.
I love that. You cited a few studies where the beliefs that people had, the placebo effect, are actually stronger than the drug's effect. Can you give a couple case studies or talk about that?
Yes, there was quite a famous study done. It was done many, many years ago before. Now you have to go through human studies section to do a study. But what they did was to recruit women with morning sickness. And they said, we're going to give you a drug to quell the nausea. And what they gave them was syrup of ipecac, which makes people throw up. And 40 or 50% of those women who got the syrup of ipecac responded to it by having no more nausea. So the belief was stronger than the drug. And belief is a form of hypnosis. And we live in hypnosis all the time. And that's why if your doctor tells you, you're going to die from this disease, it's like a curse. Many people will take that in and they'll pretty much die right when the doctor told them they were going to go. So here's another anecdote, and this comes from a very good friend of mine who was a physician in on this particular case. A man was told that he had 6 weeks or so to live. He came in and he was told he had stage 4 cancer. It was the end. And he actually died about 6 weeks later. And then when his slides were reviewed, it was a mistake. He'd never had cancer at all. And so this is essentially modern day cursing. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very important. I used to have to try to dehypnotize my patients by saying, well, the doctor told you you can expect to live a year, but that's average. There are some people who die of something else 20 years later. And why is it that you wouldn't be one of those people? And hey, it's great. We all need to get our affairs in order because life runs so much better that way. But just think of, it's like doing a major house cleaning and you'll feel so much better later. But think about being one of those people who lives forever with this. And just back to the spontaneous remission, if you can identify one person who lived with what you've got, you're way ahead of the game.
You said that the mind-body clinic, you dealt with cancer, and the conventional or allopathic treatment model doesn't really work for chronic illnesses, right? Can you talk about...
Well, yeah, we have, our medical system is absolutely fantastic for things like broken bones, for acute illnesses. And I'm hoping that little by little, cancer will become like a broken bone, that we will find the magic bullet that turns off a cancer cell. In fact, I know that for sure, that will happen. And yet cancer is over 100 different illnesses, so there's a lot of magic bullets that need to be found. But there are many illnesses. Let's take diabetes and prediabetes. We have currently 25% of our population is pre-diabetic. And about 9% of our population has type 2 diabetes. This is a very unhappy thing because it leads to tremendous side effects. It leads to disease of the eyes, of the nerves. It leads to kidney disease. It leads to heart disease. It's awful. What modern medicine tries to do is manage the disease with various drugs. You can actually reverse, almost anybody can reverse type 2 diabetes with lifestyle changes in a month's time, and it will simply go away. Get rid of the carbs and start to exercise. Get rid of the junk food. Eat whole foods with low carbs, and your whole insulin sensitivity is going to reset itself. And this is what we can do for ourselves. That's just one example. Do you know that 90% of what takes people to the doctor is stress-related illnesses? They leave with antidepressants. They leave with every kind of medication. And if they could leave with the skills of breathing, meditation, mindfulness, cleaning up your diet, cleaning up your regrets and resentments, many of the illnesses that are currently crippling us as individuals and also crippling our economy would go away. And that's the problem we have. And I'll just say another big part of the problem, and I'm so sorry for physicians. Many of them, almost all of them, are so good-hearted and beautifully trained, and they can really save our lives. But they are overworked. If you're trying to see 6 patients in an hour, all you can do is write a prescription. Interesting how that happens. A friend of mine who is a physician who speaks Navajo and worked with the Navajo before she was a physician, went back to see them, went back to see some of the people she'd known like 30, 40 years ago. And they said, well, what are you doing? And she said, I'm a physician. And she couldn't remember the Navajo word. and they used a word that means he who gives out pills. And if that's your idea of what a doctor is, it's unfortunate, but that's what often has happened. And that's why chronic illnesses are really opportunities for lifestyle change and change of mind.
In like lupus and fibromyalgia, like are those diseases based on emotions
you come to something very interesting. Before we had mind-body medicine, before we had integrative medicine, we had psychosomatic medicine. And it gave the field a bad name because people took psychosomatic to mean it's all in your head. You're just a hopeless neurotic. Nothing is wrong with you. You know, get up and fly right and forget this stuff. And that was very, very unfortunate because there's always more than one component. You may have a weakness somewhere genetically, and then a period of stress came, and then you're living in a house that has mold in it. And we know now that quite a lot of the constellation of things that include fibromyalgia, various types of chronic fatigue syndrome, are actually caused by mold. And if you take the person away from the mold, some physicians send people to the desert, literally, and they burn all their belongings and get rid of everything with mold in it, and then eventually start to lose a little of that sensitivity. They get better. It's not all in their heads, but it may have been precipitated by stress. It may have been precipitated by stuff in the diet, and then there was an environmental factor. And so all of these things come together. And I think it's very, very important not to fall into what I consider mind-body hell. And that is people who say, I'm sick, it must be that it's all my fault, and it's just more proof that I'm not as good as I should be. That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. We all know people who live long, they have a rotten diet, rotten thoughts, and are stressed, and at 103, they're still making people around them absolutely miserable. And then we all know people who actually are very happy people, don't store up a lot of stress, and they're 35 years old and they have terrible lupus. And we need to really realize it's a Venn diagram where your thoughts and emotions are just part of it. At times, if you look, you even look through religious history, you'll find like St. Julian of Norwich was a Catholic saint. She was actually the first woman to ever write a book. She was an English saint. Go Julian. And she had this terrible illness, and she felt that it was her destiny because the illness had really opened her up to make a deeper communion with the divine. And she was really happy to take that trade-off. And we see so little. I can tell you this local existence that we have is tiny. There are reasons for things that our mind cannot see and cannot fathom. You know, my very dear friend Larry Dossie talks about 3 eras of understanding in medicine. And the first is physical medicine, and it's so important, understanding this causes that. You know, if you smoke, it can cause cancer. Understanding what's called the etiology, what leads to what in disease. The second era of medicine is mind-body medicine, the understanding that your mind does make a difference. But the third era of medicine, which is just beginning to come now, is this, that I know my mind affects my body, but in era 3 medicine, your mind may affect my body, or things at a great distance, or things that aren't even in this universe. Now look at string theory, and a lot of string theorists says, there are parallel universes. There may be 100,000 copies of Kelly. One of her is well, one of her has this illness or that illness, and that there's some possibility that some Kelly had a choice in these incarnations and might have actually chosen illness, like Julian of Norwich. So I don't think we can blame ourselves, because most of us are just kind of in a local state of consciousness where we're not privy to these other things.
Parallel universes.
Right.
About children, is there, again, you never know why. Did the child chose to come into this world with that story or with that experience? If it's something in their environment, if it's something in utero, we don't know, right?
That's right.
How can we support the parents to help the child? How can we communicate to a child what they can do for themselves? Is there something?
I'll tell you a story. When my youngest son, Andre, was 6, he developed a big plantar wart in the bottom of his foot. He was limping around, and of course the doctor wanted to surgically remove the plantar wart. And surgery is traumatic for kids. You can end up with PTSD from medical procedures as a child, and I didn't want that to happen to him. And I was working with a guy, very, very interesting physician at Tufts Medical School, who had just reviewed the literature on hypnosis and warts. And warts can easily be removed by suggestion. There were all these cures for warts, like get moss from the dark side of a tree on a full moon and rub it on there and it will go away. So I thought, kids are imaginative. They have great imaginations. And hypnosis is simple with a child. They live in fairyland anyhow. And so I said to Andre, okay, can you tell me someone who is magic? And even though, we're Jewish, I call myself a Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, psychoneuroimmunologist. We had just visited a church. I took the kids to all kinds of things. They said, well, Jesus Christ is magic. And I said, well, great. Let's sit by your bed every night, and we're going to hold your foot, and you're going to say with me, begone, 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 wart, begone. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. We did that, and at the end of a week, the wart had turned black, and at the end of 2 weeks, it had fallen off, and there was just new pink skin underneath that. And that was really a terrific demonstration for him that anything is possible, and that magic is possible.
Can you talk about creative visualization and like hypnotherapy as tools for healing?
Now, back in 1967, you started to have, I happened to be working with Dr. Herbert Benson, who is the person who really brought meditation into medicine with the relaxation response. He was also studying biofeedback. And that was the first indication that we could take an unconscious function like blood pressure or heart rate and use feedback to make the unconscious conscious, so that, like, what do you feel like when your blood pressure rises? And then people start to get very interested in imagination and imagery. We can't all be hooked up to biofeedback equipment, but what if I did something like, if I had high blood pressure, simply imagine the gauge in the doctor's office where the blood pressure is, and as I sit and breathe quietly, just imagining it going down a notch at a time, going down, and blood pressure will go down. What if I told you to do a simple exercise of imagination, to go to your refrigerator, open it up, find a lemon, take the lemon, put it on the cutting board, cut the thing in half, take a look at it, juice is welling up, and stick out your tongue and lick it. Your salivary glands would go crazy, and it was all in your imagination. So there's no question that what we imagine can affect our physiology. And the trouble is, mostly we imagine very nasty things in there. And so that's why often in healing imagery exercises, We'll start by imagining a beautiful place, and in as much detail as you can. So it helps to imagine a place where you've actually once been. And I live now in New Mexico, and there's a river and running water and red mountains behind it. And I know the contours of this landscape. I know them like the back of my hand, and they're so dear to me. And if I'm somewhere and I'm not feeling so well, I can bring up my safe space, my healing space, which would be sitting by the river right outside where we are now. And then I would bring up an image. For example, I didn't sleep so well last night, and I thought, oh my, we're going to have a film crew here, and I hardly slept. And then I've got all these other things happening. So this morning, I sat and I envisioned myself sitting here now, full of life, full of vitality. And that's what you do. And that's very different than walking around saying, oh, woe is me, I'm exhausted. How am I going to do this? Because when you imagine that, that's what you're going to get. So always to think, what are you imagining in your mind's eye? And then making that conscious. So there was a study done in a burn unit. This was a study I heard about from a wonderful researcher on imagery, Jean, who passed over several years ago. And it was for burned children, the burn unit. And the hypnotherapist who was working with the kids suggested that they imagined their skin and the skin graft as fingers coming out toward each other and then knitting together. And the group of kids who did the imagery, who saw that in their mind's eye, actually had better performance of the skin graft. It healed faster with fewer, untoward things that happened in the process. And so imagery is very important. And I do tell people it's not just reserved for when you're sitting and in a meditative state. You can change an image in your mind like that in milliseconds. But you have to notice, like, ooh, I'm holding a bad one here. And then that's what mindfulness does. It gives you awareness. And only when you have awareness do you have choice. You have to be aware of what you're thinking. Then you can choose the image of something different or a story that's different.
I love that term, awfulizing. It's like using your imagination in a
right.
bad way, right?
That's right.
So if you want to just continue that thought with
Yes.
the awfulizing, which is what we mostly do all the time.
There's a very cool psychologist by the name of Albert Ellis. And he was very outspoken and very cute in how he said things. And he would say, if you'd start going on in yourself about how bad things were, he'd say, you're awfulizing. Or if you were really imagining the worst, he'd say, you're catastrophizing. And just having those words really helps people. That when you realize you're off on a really negative riff, you can say, I'm just awfulizing. It's normal. People awfulize. And then you can say, I'm going to take a breath or two, kind of clean your palate, clean your thinking palate, and think of something good instead. Now, I don't by this mean that you ignore all bad things in the world, because you still have to get out of the line of a car if one is coming and things of that nature.
You talk about reframing attack as a need for love, like the attack of another is actually a cry for help. Can we do that for tumors and illnesses as well? Like when a kid scrapes their knee, the mom showers that scrape with love.
Absolutely. You can certainly send love to the parts of your body that need it. It's a very important thing. There's an ancient meditation, in fact, called the microcosmic orbit meditation. And it involves smiling at your internal organs. So if you haven't smiled at your liver lately, it's quite a process. And I think it's very important to smile upon your whole body. And I would smile upon all the health in your body, and I would see your tumor shrinking, because whatever it was that it was trying to heal can be healed in some stead by your love.
Give us your one takeaway message about healing to the audience.
So the big takeaway about healing, anything is possible. Hope is your biggest ally. And when you love yourself, when you truly love yourself and recognize that you're quite a magical being, when you heal your past, get rid of all the stuff that's bothering you, you'll find that healing happens, and it feels so wonderful. Feels like you're light as a feather.